Hello everyone. This is just a short lesson for those of you who missed the live lesson today. Just going through how to answer this question. So on the Elizabeth paper, the first question is an 8-mark question, and it is always going to give you an interpretation, an historical interpretation. You don't need to worry too much about where this comes from. You just need to be able to read the interpretation, and you need to think about how convincing that interpretation is. So how much truth you would give it, how much weight you would give this particular interpretation. So we'll just read the question and the interpretation. So the question is, to what extent is interpretation 1 convincing about Elizabeth's relationship with Parliament? Use interpretation 1 and your own knowledge to explain your answer. So the interpretation is all about Elizabeth's relationship with Parliament. So let's just read that. So the interpretation says, Queen Elizabeth and Parliament didn't always see eye to eye when it came to governing the country, but the Queen managed to keep England's MPs in check throughout her reign. This was mostly down to the skill of her Privy Councillors. If it wasn't for the Privy Council's clever manipulation, which means control, of parliamentary debate, MPs could have effectively held the Queen to ransom until she agreed to compromise with them on a range of issues. Thankfully for Elizabeth, the Privy Council stopped this from ever happening. So the first thing you need to do is think about what are the key things that the source actually says. So one of the things to appreciate here and to really think about is that the first thing that the source actually really talks about is that they didn't see eye to eye when it came to governing the country. So that suggests there was tension between Queen Elizabeth and Parliament. So you need to think about, does your own knowledge support that, or does your own knowledge go against that? The other thing that the source and the interpretation really talks about is that the main reason why the Queen managed to keep England's MPs in check, so she kept them under control, was down to the skill of her Privy Councillors. So it talks about the fact that the reason why Elizabeth had no problem with Parliament was because of the Privy Council, and we can see there some key phrases. So that's the first thing to do, is to decide what is the interpretation that the source is offering. Now, sometimes it can help to actually break it down a little bit, this question. But the big thing to really emphasize is you only need to use your own knowledge to help you to decide how convincing the interpretation is. You do not need to talk about anything like the provenance of the source or where it comes from. So it's not about whether a source is biased. It's all about using your own knowledge to weigh up how convincing the interpretation is. So you might take an extract from the source. So here, for example, Queen Elizabeth and Parliament didn't always see eye to eye when it came to governing the country, but the Queen managed to keep England's MPs in check throughout her reign. So you might want to think from this part of the source, how convincing is it? So here's an example answer. So you could say, well, it is convincing they didn't always see eye to eye. And then what you need to do is bring in your own knowledge. So what is your own knowledge of how the Queen and her Parliament didn't agree? So I've put here in this example answer, for example, Parliament often clashed with Elizabeth about religion, with many MPs being Puritan. Furthermore, Parliament angered Elizabeth in wanting to discuss her marriage plans and the succession, so Elizabeth angrily banned them from talking about it. So that is own knowledge, which supports the view they didn't always see eye to eye. You can even talk about the MP Peter Wentworth, who was imprisoned, so therefore it does show that she was able to kind of keep the MPs in check and that they didn't always see eye to eye. So that's what you've got to do. You've got to use your own knowledge to find evidence to agree, but also evidence to disagree with the interpretation. So another example here, if you look at this part of the source, this was mostly down to the Privy Councillors. If it wasn't for the Privy Council's clear manipulation of parliamentary debate, MPs could have effectively held the Queen to ransom until she agreed to compromise with them on a range of issues. You could talk about here how this is partially convincing. Parliament could hold the Queen to ransom. She needed them to grant taxation, but there were other reasons for this. And what I would say is that this interpretation underestimates the role of the Queen herself, of Elizabeth herself, in controlling Parliament. Don't forget that she often attended Parliament to make speeches. She had the power of patronage, which meant that many MPs owed their positions and of power within the country. They owed those positions to Elizabeth. So if they did upset Elizabeth or annoy Elizabeth, then they could lose their positions of power or their monopolies, for example. So therefore, talking about how the Privy Councillors were solely, you know, they did obviously have an important role to play, and the Privy Councillors were in Parliament, but it perhaps overestimates that. So on the next slide, here is an example answer just to help you out. So probably what the best thing to do is to, in your first paragraph, talk about what is convincing about the interpretation, and thinking about what's good about the interpretation. Second paragraph, talk about how maybe the interpretation isn't quite so convincing, and then you need to give an overall conclusion about overall, what is your judgment? How convincing is this interpretation? Is it very convincing, quite convincing, partially convincing, and so on? So I'll just read that example answer out to you and you can follow it. So interpretation 1 is fairly convincing about Elizabeth's relationship with Parliament because it suggests they didn't always see eye to eye. Now that's a really important thing to do, to make sure you're quoting from the interpretation and then using your own knowledge to assess how convincing it is. This is convincing because some Puritan MPs in Parliament tried to challenge her religious settlement. Parliament also angered Elizabeth by wanting to discuss her marital status and the succession. In fact, Elizabeth actually banned Parliament from discussing this. Then you can go on. Interpretation 1 is quite convincing when it talks about how the Privy Council helped to control Parliament. The evidence to support this is that members of the Privy Council sat in Parliament and did help steer debates in favour of her policies. However, the interpretation overemphasises the importance of the Privy Council. Elizabeth herself used her charm, great speeches and force of personality to control Parliament, even having an MP called Peter Wentworth arrested in 1576. So you've got kind of evidence that both agrees and disagrees with the interpretation. Third paragraph, your conclusion. Therefore, overall, the interpretation does give a convincing view of the tensions between Elizabeth and the Parliament, but places too much emphasis on the role of the Privy Council and neglects to mention how Elizabeth herself was able to control Parliament. So it's often good as well, within your answer, to think about what the source doesn't talk about and maybe what is missing from the interpretation as well. So I hope that helps. If you still have any questions or you're not sure how to structure it or what to do for this question, then please do let me know. Thank you very much for listening. Bye bye.